Good afternoon and welcome to yet another event from the LSE South Asia Centre. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar and I'm the Deputy Director of the Centre. I'm very, very happy to welcome you to this very special event that we have curated, which deals with the current situation in Myanmar, something that concerns all of us and is therefore accordingly titled Military Myanmar Fearing Freedom. As the title explains quite unequivocally, Myanmar is a region that is important for several reasons, but it is revealing that it is a country that is of interest to both the region that is traditionally called South Asia, as well as Southeast Asia. As such, I am very happy to also say that the LSE South Asia Centre is doing this event in collaboration with the Saw Swee Hock Southeast Asia Centre here at the London School of Economics, and I'm very grateful to them for the collaboration and the support that they have provided us. The event today has been curated very, with a lot of forethought and with a lot of concern about what is happening in Myanmar at the moment. And before I go on to introduce our very eminent panel of speakers, there are some things that I'd like to announce for the benefit of the audience, as well as for the speakers who are here today. As you know, this event is being live streamed on YouTube. The chat function is enabled, and you are welcome as members of the audience to pose questions to the speakers as the event is going on. Once the speakers have spoken and the discussion gets underway, I will pose questions. You can ask questions to individual speakers. You can also ask a question to the entire panel. If you're going to ask it to an individual speaker, just mention who it is that you would like the question answered by. The event is being recorded. A recording of this event will be available from tomorrow on our website. It will be an unedited recording. And when I ask questions from members of the audience, I will not reveal the names of those who have asked the questions, even though your names will be visible on the YouTube website. But in keeping with LSE regulations, I won't be announcing the names of those who are asking questions. That is sort of, the fact that your names will be there on the website is one of the things that we just have to make a compromise with. But on the upside, we also are able, because this is an online event, to bring together this kind of a gathering of panelists from literally from all over the world and in very different time zones. And I know that we also have several members of the audience who are in very different time zones, quite literally from the United States all the way to Malaysia and various other countries in Southeast Asia, because they have written to the center saying that they would like to attend. If you would like to tweet, then please do tweet and tag us at SAsiaLSE. I will now introduce the speakers. But before that, could I mention that we have decided in advance on an order in which the panelists will speak. And also we have decided what would be the best way in which to structure this for the benefit of the discussion that will follow, as well as for the benefit of the audience, because not everyone is actually aware of all the details concerning the event today. In that context, I should also mention that, concerned as we all are with what is happening in Myanmar at the moment, we were very careful while inviting speakers to ensure that we did not invite speakers from within Myanmar. This is intentional, that we did not invite speakers within Myanmar, those that we had access to or could have accessed, because we did not want to do an event that would in any way put any individual in any kind of danger. As a result, we have very carefully chosen the speakers today. who are all, I know, very aware of what is happening in Myanmar at the moment. And in that context, I should mention that I'm especially grateful to Dominic, whom I will introduce just now, who has played an equal role in curating this event and in working out how we could invite speakers that would make this a very, very meaningful event, and one that we hope will generate discussion. David Brenner is lecturer in global insecurities at the University of Sussex and the author of Rebel Politics, a political sociology of armed struggle in Myanmar's borderlands, which was published in 2019. Htike Htike is a Rohingya research scholar and refugee advocate from Rakhine State and is currently conducting her research for her PhD on the interrelationship between illicit drugs trade, state complicity, and nation building in Myanmar at Queen Mary University of London. Wai Hnin Pwint Thon is a Burmese human rights activist with the Burma Campaign UK here in London, and the daughter of Mya Aye, current and former political prisoner who has been at the forefront of Burma's democracy movement for over 30 years. Sawangwangse Yonghui is a Burmese artist and the grandson of Htike Htike, the first president of the Union of Burma, who was overthrown and imprisoned in the military coup in 1961. Dominique de Lefebvre, about whom I was speaking slightly earlier, is pursuing his PhD here at LSE in the Department of Anthropology, and his research concerns Myanmar. I should say once again that the South Asia Center, as well as the Southeast Asia Center, is extremely grateful to Dominic for his support over the last several months when we have organized this event. How we will conduct this event is that for the benefit of the very wide-angled audience that we have at the moment, I have requested Dominic to speak for 5 minutes at the beginning, just to make everyone aware of the recent events that have happened in Myanmar. And once Dominic has spoken, then Htike will speak after that. So Dominic, would you like to go first? You have about 5 minutes. You need to unmute yourself.
Is that better? Thank you, Nilanjan, and the South Asia Center for putting this together. And thanks you all for joining. It's a pleasure to be here and joined by all these fantastic speakers. I'm excited to have this discussion. So as Nilanjan said, just to give some background, as most of you are probably aware, on February 1st, Myanmar's military junta undertook a coup d'etat, with the military detaining members of the newly elected civilian government early that morning, leading to the full re-entrenchment of military control in a country already largely within the de facto control of the country's armed forces, known as the Tatmadaw. As the weeks unfolded after the military coup of the morning of February 1st, the world watched in shock, as Aung San Suu Kyi and members of her party, the NLD, were arrested and political activists were rounded up and detained. Several days after the coup, an incredible range of protests erupted across the country, demonstrating a fierce opposition to the military seizure of power in a wide range of forms and purpose. Regardless, these people were united in their opposition to the Tatmadaw. These protests rapidly engulfed the country, from the ethnic Burma heartlands to the small remote cities in areas of the country such as northern Kachin State, from the Delta to the Shan and Karen Highlands, even in areas beyond the reach of state control. These ebullient protests were gradually met with increasing violence, with individual deaths reported in mid-February now receding into the distance as the tragic results of the ongoing massacre of civilians by the Tatmadaw, resulting in over 800 dead, while over 4,300 people remain in detention, with nearly 2,000 warrants reported. Now, nearly 4 months after the coup, with the arrest of large amounts of political activists, factory workers, strike organizers, journalists, and people from all walks of life living in fear throughout the country, and as protest movements turn into pockets of violence and anti-military resistance throughout the country, we must ask ourselves, what brought us here and where are we going? Amidst profound continued insecurity, widespread violence, and a breakdown in basic services across the country, people's lives continue to be increasingly precarious. In other areas, largely in the borderlands of the country, an intense civil war has been ongoing virtually since independence in 1948. Such a war between the state and its internal enemies, as they call them, has been central to the formation of Tatmadaw, Myanmar's armed forces, and the continued legitimacy of the military throughout the history of the country. This LSE event has highlighted two quite monumental terms in its description: democracy and freedom. For many, the events of February 1st signified the end of what many called a transitory period, in which some envisaged the movement away from military dictatorship and towards an awkward form of power sharing between the military and the democratically elected New League for Democracy, or NLD. In the wake of the coup, members of the NLD have formed, alongside a precarious coalition of representatives, a national unity government, or NUG. To people watching the events unfold in Myanmar, there is a striking and deeply saddening sense of history repeating itself, something all the panelists here will be very aware of, as scars and traumas from cycles of violence and the effects of military rule reappear to the forefront again. Yet, there is still a clear sense that something significant has shifted and the Burmese people will once again suffer. But what kinds of hope can we find in these shifts, and where can we begin to unpack what has happened? I know that's a lot to cover, but I hope we can discuss some of these things in the event. And again, I'm glad to have you all here. And on that note, I wish to pass to Mya Aye. Thank you.
Let me just introduce Htike once again. Htike Htike is a Rohingya research scholar and refugee advocate from Rakhine State, and is currently conducting research for her PhD on the interrelationship between illicit drugs trade, state complicity, and nation building in Myanmar at Queen Mary University of London. Htike, please speak now. You have about 8 minutes.
Thank you everyone for having me here today, and thanks everyone for attending these events. So the question for us today here is, what sort of a democracy we can hope from current point was after the coup. So before we talk about what kind of democracy we can really aim for the future in Myanmar, I would like to also go back a little bit of what kind of democracy we have in Myanmar in the pre-coup times. So then we can a bit formulate, okay, what's exactly we are hoping from the current stage of the Myanmar political situations. We all know that in Myanmar in pre-coup times, the politics was controlled by the Tatmadaw military with their 2008 constitutions. And that is one layer. Another layer is NLD was predominantly oppressed the ethnic right, media, even like a resistance against military in ethnic state, and other form of also resistance, such as the student-led, protests, activist group, there was a different form of operation has taken by the NLD. I mean, also one particularly where I come from, the Rakhine State and Rohingya, the top leader of NLD actively supported crimes against Rohingya. There was an obvious example where the ICG, where NLD state councillor was presented to support their military. And also there are other forms of crimes in ethnic area, which was also supported by the NLD party. Then after the coup, so we have the CRPH, Committee of Representatives for Pitu Latto, which is a dominant, which is the NLD representatives, and General Strike Committee of Nationality, which is formed by all the party taking the protest state on the streets. So together with these two groups, especially with the CRPH and their consultations, sort of consultation with their General Strike Committee of Nationality, we have formed national unity governments. So most are CRPH member, but there are a few members from GSC and General Strike Committee of Nationality. If we look at the roadmap of the national unity government, as far as I have observed currently, there are approach taken by like three different ways. Three way of resuming democracy in the country. One is about called civilian disobedience movement, which has been inviting all the government staff, saying that you should disconnect working with the military, and then it showed that they will have a kind of resilience to continue the democracy the way they want. However, when we look at the civilian disobedience, it was quite a kind of a very widely joined by the nation voice. But however, there is still not like alternative option for the people. What can exactly and how long the civilian disobedience movement can last, and what can be the option for the next. But then there is another way of PDF, which called People Defense Forces, which was just recently formed in the beginning of May. Then there are also some sort of armed resistance ongoing in certain area, which is a bit quite worrying for me, because PDF is very newly formed of our forces, but then to be able to beat the military, long-standing military institutions as a kind of is a bit quite of on very like a big ambitious, which is, I will say. And then the shower in the ethnic area has been continued. We had like at least two area in this month, such as Minda and Chin State, you know, in Rakhine State, you know, Dimoso in Konde State, where has been so many like a clash happening with their different actors, including PDF, and then also the ethnic armed group, and then military. And then the PDF is also asking their non-civilian disobedience group to leave the village, which is another layer of violence happening, because these people might have no option. But then if PDF has come in and saying that you should leave and you should really disengage, there should be a kind of alternative way of offering to them. So third way of our national unity government approach is reforming the constitution, which is also in the process of the reforming in the country. And they recently formed a committee to reform this federal constitution, forming a federal constitutions. But I would like to take an opportunity to go back to the Rohingya situation again. So the paper I have read, a draft paper I have read from National Unity Government is really, really concerning, because the policy paper is pretty much resemble of NLD government policy, which includes saying that they have to follow the Kofi Annan Commission's recommendation. So Kofi Annan recommendation commission was very much NLD central approach, and then does include also amending 1982 citizenship law, which I will say this is not going to be solving because 1982 citizenship has so much problem. And then the third point on this policy paper has written is also about with the discussion with the Rakhine community, which is another very disappointing. We'll look at all these things, the policy paper from the Rohingya, for the Rohingya issue, from National Unity Government, newly formed the government's body, civilians government body. I will say that's still pretty much NLD policy, which is not going to help or anything for Rohingya. Thank you. I think maybe my time is already past.
No, you have a couple of more minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, so then, so the way I would like to shape about the current situation in Myanmar is, although we have a kind of step to taking about to form the resistance for the military governments, we have a pretty much weaker also a government body, civilian government body. First is the how we're gonna be really taking approach from continue the civilian disobedience movement. Third is how we really gonna be working with the PDF People Defense Forces to really combat Tamato, which is a long-standing group. And third, how can really ethnic right can be consumed if NLD is still pretty much dominant, was kept from the previous regime, and then they have not been discussed about really issue such as the Rohingya. And the international stage, there is the crimes in the ICJ and ICC. The newly formed national unity government has not shown their willingness to support those to these cases in the crime, and they haven't really have any kind of initiation to also to signatory of the Rome Statute and so on. So this is something like a concerning that's probably the way of democracy we're having is pretty much weak, and that's probably not much different than what we have in pre-coup times here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Htike. Several issues that you raised that are very, very important. I'm sure we'll return to them in the discussion, but thank you very much for your initial remarks, which were made both very empathetically as well as powerfully. David Brenner will speak next. David is a lecturer in global insecurities at the University of Sussex and the author of Rebel Politics, a political sociology of the armed struggle in Myanmar's Borderlands, which was published in 2019. And for the benefit of those who are watching on YouTube, David is going to show a map during his talk. David, please speak now. You have about 8 minutes.
Thanks very much for inviting me, for having me on this really fascinating panel. Let me show a map first, actually, and then I'll put it away again. I think the map is just important, and I've seen that in a few talks before, because it shows the immense complexity of what are called EAOs, or ethnic armed organizations in Myanmar. I hope you can see the map. If you don't, please just say something. Okay, great. The map is a bit outdated by now. It's from Burma News International, and I think it was published in 2014. What it doesn't show the Arakan army to the west of the country at the Indian border now. But it does show quite a few, at least, of the major ethnic armed organizations and, well, let's say the areas of operation. They don't control all those territories, but the areas of operation. I want to speak a little bit about the politics of ethnic armed organizations in the wake of the coup. Because I think, first of all, it's quite important to understand the diverging positioning that ethnic armed organizations have done in the country. Because there's been a lot of, well, hope, in many ways, that these ethnic armed organizations that haven't just emerged now, but that have been fighting for decades against the military in a civil war that's been going on ever since the country's independence, as Dominic was also raising, rather than a civil war that the country might be sliding in now, something that we hear a lot actually falsely portrayed, I think, in international media. And there's been, of course, a lot of hope that these ethnic armed organizations are forming somewhat of a united front in challenging the military. Well, first of all, just a few remarks of these about the ethnic armed organizations that we see here on the map. They're fighting for greater autonomy, for greater minority rights from an ethnocratic state that's been dominated by the military. And they, well, are usually different in terms of their size and also their politics. So I won't be able to do justice to all of them at all in the remaining 6 minutes that I have. But I will try to at least raise a few factors to understand why we've seen such hugely diverging positioning of some of those ethnic armed organizations. So I'll just stop sharing that map now. So we've seen the Karen National Union, for instance, and the Kachin Independence Organization, for instance, taking really strong positions in favor for, well, now the National Unity Government, but also before for the Spring Revolution, sheltering revolutionaries in their areas, engaging the army heads-on in offensive combat that we haven't seen for decades, close to urban centers like Myitkyina, for instance, but also in remote areas like northern Rakhine State, taking over various military outposts, etc. And of course, there's been, therefore, also a lot of expectations for EAOs more generally. At the same time, we've seen, for instance, the United Wa States Army welcoming or negotiating at least with Tatmadaw representatives, and other EAOs just generally being more quiet, actually, more careful of engaging. I want to just make a few points now, what might be explaining such differing engagement. What is often raised, but I think often overstated, is the international politics of it. Often we hear, well, China is so important, surely China is important, but EAOs in Myanmar have their own agency, they make their own decisions. They're not just the pawns of some other principle here. What we hear also often that is indeed very important is, of course, the Tatmadaw, the military's divide and rule strategy, that the military has relied on ever since while ruling the country, actually. It's a colonial strategy that comes out of British imperialism in the country to divide and rule the country along ethnic lines. And that's kind of given very much the impetus to military rule in the country in a very Tillian way of war making as state making. So that is important. For instance, when we think about the Arakan army that has been much more careful of engaging with the National Unity Government, for instance, the Arakan army just had a ceasefire just before the coup. That certainly wasn't a coincidence that the military was reaching out to the Arakan army to pacify a front that was the hottest front in the last years in Myanmar in many ways. And then being able to concentrate on other ethnic armed organizations. And we've seen that for decades, basically. But here again, then I want to just raise the actual strategic considerations that ethnic armed organizations make themselves rather than just reacting to something. And of course, from the Arakan army side, well, there's a strategic consideration of having a ceasefire with the military now, because the Arakan army has fought so heavily over the last years, not least because it didn't have territory in the west of the country. So it had to wrestle off territory. And now, of course, for many of the ethnic armed organizations, well, like the Arakan army, it might be quite also an opportunity to consolidate, for instance, their presence. But then also, of course, we've seen the Kachin Independence Organization, the Karen National Union, fighting very heavily. And their decisions to do so was shaped by what I would see two different relations. This is at least something that I've been looking at before, and I think it might make sense today as well. Vertical relations between the ethnic armed organizations and their constituents and local communities, as well as horizontal relations between different leaders. So on the vertical relation sides, ethnic armed organizations have very pronounced relationships to their constituents. They're very strong social base often, and there are bottom-up pressures also that are working on ethnic armed organizations. So when you see, for instance, the Kachin Independence Organization statements from the beginning about protecting civilians, but these are of course also civilians that are their constituents, and they might live in Myitkyina that is not controlled by the Kachin Independence Organization as such. And there's very many activist groups in Kachin State, in Karen State, that have a say in kind of pushing and shaping the trajectory of these movements more generally. On the horizontal relations front, what I want to just raise is that ethnic armed organizations are far from homogeneous. So we've seen, for instance, different statements coming out of the Karen National Union that is fighting with the government, that had made very strong statements in favor for the Spring Revolution. And then we've also seen some statements from particular leaders in the movement that were saying, well, we should maybe be going back to the so-called nationwide ceasefire agreement. Here we have to understand that those different statements come from different parts of the movement that have been, well, fragmented in somewhat of a form for quite a while already. And I want to come back to that. But first of all, I want to raise here the sophisticated analysis that people in these movements make themselves. So briefly after the transition, I met Htike Htike, who's the vice chief of staff of the Karen National Union, who's basically in charge of parts of the northern faction of the movement that are fighting so heavily with the army now. And back then he was just visited after the transition, after the Karen National Union had a ceasefire with the army. He was just visited by some Scandinavian diplomat who tried to pressure him to say, well, look, I know that you don't quite like the ceasefire, but you have to be pragmatic, don't be so hardline, etc. And Htike Htike was saying, well, look, if we are hardliners, which is a word that we don't like, then we are hardliners in the right respect, because we're actually seeing what these things are. We can see what happened to the Kachin Independence Organization, whose ceasefire with the army just broke down. What I just want to say here is that the reference point often in our view on Myanmar has been 2011, the country is democratizing, etc., whereas the reference points from the border areas there are very different and are to do with long histories of the ethnic conflict that I think we have to understand better to understand why there are diverging positions and to engage with these organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. We are going to come back to it because I myself have a question about something that you've said, but I'm sure there will be, my turn will come during the discussion. Before I introduce our next speaker, may I just announce once again, for those who are watching on YouTube, if you would like to ask any questions, then please feel free to ask them through the chat function. You can ask a question to a particular speaker or panelist, or you could actually pose a question to the entire panel if you would prefer to do so. Our next speaker is Sawang Wongse Yongwe, who is a Burmese artist and is the grandson of Jao Sui Taik, the first president of the Union of Burma, who was overthrown and imprisoned in the military coup in 1961. When this all began. I'm delighted to say that Sawang is actually going to show us some of his artwork. For those of you who have had the privilege of seeing some of it earlier, and there are some very good websites that show it as well, you will know that this is an absolute privilege. The fact that he has kindly agreed not only to show his work of art, but also to speak about his art in the context of today's panel discussion is a matter of great privilege to us. Sawang, please speak now. You can share your screen as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I'm happy to be part of this panel. I will, yeah, I'll share the images now, and then I'll basically be talking over it. Okay, I'll begin. The coup is a soul-crushing experience. As the coup unfolded, seeing the killings perpetrated by the military have reminded me that my uncle was only 17 years old when he was killed in Burma's 1962 coup. My father, Zhao Chang Yongwei, was in his 20s then, experienced the same frustration and anger that the young people are experiencing now. The 1962 coup led him to the jungle to take arm against injustice. I've lived through this experience, from being born in the jungle in Shan State army camp to living under another identity in Thailand to immigrating to Canada. Seeing violence early in my life, I realized we carry our wounds with us. This has been the experience of ethnic people of Burma for generations. Let's not forget the Rohingya massacre in 2017, where nearly 800,000 people were chased out of the country. Western countries largely missed the boat on that. They missed all the sign, 25,000 killed, villages burned, ethnic cleansing with genocidal intent. And yet the EU goes on to fund MyPol, the Myanmar police, and institutions that are now enforcing the coup. We need to keep this in mind as the war in Rakhine State, the airstrikes and the artillery shells that rain down on the ethnic groups in Shan State and Rakhine State. And in the last 3 months, there had been a campaign of violence conducted by military on its people. And there has also been an uprising from the people. We can see that even the local defense forces are fighting back, first in the urban areas and now also in the rural ethnic areas. But they are on their own and in different groups. I asked our leader to reflect a moment at this situation. When we say people will win, and I have no doubt that people will win, what I'm interested in is what we will do the day after this victory. This is where the real work begins. And then when you talk about new unity, I wonder what that means. Will this new unity be really just a platform in waiting for Aung San Suu Kyi? Or will this new unity be a real reconciliation in which historical injustices are addressed and in which we can finally share a table as equal people? The military are like zombies. They exist in a framework sustained by law, but they are not governed by the rule of law. They have shown themselves to be the enemy of the people. Like the disemboweled corpse, its ontological status has changed, yet it goes on talking, laughing, and chewing on its own innards. This is a concept and perception that I explore in my work. Lastly, I shall end with a quote by Frantz Fanon from The Wretched of the Earth. Violence alone perpetrated by the people, violence organized and guided by leadership, provides the key for the masses to decipher the social reality. Without this struggle, without this praxis, there's nothing but a carnival parade and a lot of hot air. All that is left is a slight readaptation, a few reforms at the top, a flag, and down at the bottom, a shapeless riding mass still mired in the dark ages. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's all.
Thank you very much, Sawang. There was one work of art that had a panther in it, a black panther in it, and had something written on it. Could you translate it into English for us?
It says, beware of psychological operation.
Right. Okay.
Psychological warfare.
Okay, thank you. Because I can see from the YouTube that there are a lot of people watching from all over the country, all over the world, sorry, who may not know Burmese and may not be able to read the script. But thank you very much. We will come back to several of the issues, the disturbing issues that you raised, especially in the last work of art. I actually saw all of them yesterday when you sent them to me, so I spent a bit of time looking at it.
And the other image with the red and white with also some writing, it says, "If we unite, the military will fail." So.
Yeah. Right. I'm now going to invite Wai Hnin Pwint Thon, who is a Burmese human rights activist with the Burma Campaign UK here in London, and is the daughter of Mya Aye, the current and former political prisoner who has been at the forefront of Burma's democracy movement for about 30 years. Once Wai Hnin has finished speaking, Dominic will take over and start the discussion, and we will take questions from the audience, and we will also have a discussion amongst the panelists. So Wai Hnin, please speak now. After that, Dominic, please speak.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and thank you for organizing this event as well, especially at a very difficult and challenging time for Burma. People, since 1st of February, people are, the whole country is living in fear. They don't know when the military will burst into their homes, arresting them or killing them, because arrest continues as we speak. There are now more than 4,300 political detainees in prison. And that's the number that we know, but there are so many numbers that we don't know, especially in ethnic areas. We don't know how many people have simply disappeared and being arrested and killed in ethnic area. And in terms of peaceful protesters, more than 820 have been killed, including many, many children. And I work with a lot of families of political prisoners in the country, and every day I hear the stories of arrest and stories of their detention, and they are all horrifying, because many of the family members don't know where their loved ones are being kept, or where they are being detained, and they don't know the condition of that person. And we hear so many cases of people being tortured in detention center, and there are so many cases of horrifying sexual harassment and sexual assaults against female political prisoners. So people are very, very worried. And there are many cases of people being arrested today, and then the military return the dead body the next day. So one of the mothers I spoke to last month said she would prefer her son being in prison than being in detention center or not knowing where her son is. And she preferred that maybe being in prison is actually safer than being at home after all. And these are the sad reality that people are living. But it is important to echo the previous speakers, and it is important to remember that these human rights violations committed by the Burmese military is nothing new. It's been going on for many, many years, especially in ethnic areas. And they are doing so with complete impunity. So that brings my point about what is the international community is doing, what is the role of the international community. And we saw that in 2010, when the military switched their uniform and started the civilian parliament, then when I look back my speech from 2010, a lot of the things that I said is happening right now because of the 2008 constitution and because of the military having the complete control over the country. But the international community completely got carried away when they saw the release of Aung San Suu Kyi and other high-profile political prisoners. They saw some relative freedom happening in city areas, things were improving in cities area, and they completely got carried away and they completely abandoned the ethnic minorities of the country. And now, you know, in that past 10 years, ethnic minorities had no gain. In reality, the conflicts in the area were increasing, and the Burmese military will continue attacking ethnic civilians. In Kachin State, the civil war is going, I think it's 13 days away from becoming 10 years. The civil war is happening in Kachin State. And, you know, other human rights violations happen in Karen State, Chin State. And of course, there is a Rohingya genocide happened in 2017. But there were so many warning points before we get to the genocide stage in 2017, but nothing had been done by the international community. And of course, the reaction they gave was visa bans and freezing the assets by the EU and the US and the UK for some military generals. But essentially, they don't have any assets to be frozen in these countries. So it becomes a holiday ban for committing genocide and committing human rights violations against ethnic minorities. So this created, sometimes I feel very angry with the international community because they created a sense of impunity for the military. Because now Mya Aye is actually calculating that he can get away with all the violence he's committing, and he staged the coup, thinking that international community response would be weak. And of course, we have been seeing statements after statements, but in reality, we are seeing very little and frustratingly slow response by the international community for all these atrocities happening in the country. And for human rights organizations across the country, including human rights activists inside the country, are calling for three things. One is to cut the funds. Now the military control the government, all the revenues they will get from oil, gas, timber, jams, they will be getting those revenues to buy more weapons and to strengthen their army to kill more people. Whereas they won't be using these revenues to build schools or hospitals or help people. So that comes to the second point, is arms embargo. Usually people say, oh, because of the UN Security Council structure, the China will veto the arms embargo call, but the countries individually have they can make a decision to impose arms embargo. And we saw that Japan and South Korea joined the arms embargo, and it's very encouraging. And we need more countries to follow that. And UK can take a lead on that, but we haven't seen you know, UK taking a lead in such action. And the third but very important thing is the accountability issues. We need to hold these military generals accountable, not only for the human rights violations they've committed in the past 3-4 months, but also for the decades of human rights violations they have committed. Because with that, you know, a sense of impunity, we need to end this. And so that's the role of the you know, international community. So what do we have as a hope for Burmese citizens, Burmese nationals inside the country? I see that, you know, a lot of people now are changing their mind about Rohingya. People are apologizing for not standing up for the Rohingya genocide. People are coming together, speaking out more. But we need to be mindful that all these, because of, you know, years of systematic discrimination, propaganda, the prejudice and hatred against ethnic minorities and religious minorities in Burma are deeply rooted in the society. So once things get better, let's say we hope that we see the release of Aung San Suu Kyi and other high-profile political prisoners. We hope that international community won't abandon the whole country, because Burma is not just the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi. Burma is a country with many ethnic minorities and religious minorities. So if we have a hope for federal democracy with inclusive, you know, model of federal democracy, I think this is the moment, but we have a very long way to go. And we need to be, you know, tackling the deeply rooted prejudice in the country. And I see that so many young people are getting involved in the movement now, which is very encouraging. And we will win our own freedom inside the country, but we need the international support for the very vulnerable people in the country, not just for the high profile people. So I will stop here, and then I will look forward to the discussion questions.
Thank you. Before Dominic speaks, I should say that we've had a few questions, but we'll wait for some more to come. Otherwise, we'll post these ones. That's not a problem. But thank you very much, Wai Hnin, not least because there are a lot of things that you've said, which when put alongside what the others have said, raise a series of further questions that I think need to be discussed on a platform like this. But Dominic, why don't you start and I'll jump in whenever.
Thank you to all our speakers for fascinating and interesting contributions. I was just struck by what you said, Wai Hnin, about looking back at speeches, looking back at reflections from earlier times. And I was just previously, earlier today, looking back at speeches from '62 and then around from the '88 throughout the '90s. And I think this is something I want to reflect on and be interested to hear what all of your reflections are, since to different extents, many of you have these kind of different historical experiences with Myanmar through family, through history, through research. And Sawang's art as well and Htike's comments also hinted at this kind of the scars that are carried by people and the country, and this kind of aspect of memory and how, when we look at what's going on, these cycles seem to be repeating themselves. So I guess I want to ask, maybe it's too ambitious of a question, but what are some ways through this to escape these cycles that any of you see? It's a question for all of you, actually. Maybe Wai Hnin could start, and then I'll pass it on to other speakers.
It's a very interesting question. I'm sure when my father started, getting involved in activism in the '80s, he thought that maybe we should have democracy in 2021 by now. And when I started my activism work, 12 years ago, I thought the same. But it's really sad that we are going, U-turn. And my dad's been arrested for the 3rd time, and there are so many children are now going through what I went through, when I was seeing my dad in prison and etc. But I think, although the time has changed, if we look at something positive, we keep educating each other, because even people who were involved in the 1962 or 1988 or 2007 uprising, but it's not inclusive. But now I think this is the first time for us, especially for Generation Z, starting to talk about more inclusive model of federal democracy in the country. And this is very, good to see that people in city areas are starting to become more aware of what the ethnic minority have to go through over decades. So I think this is one hope that I have, but of course it means a lot of, working together and a lot of educating each other about what the federalism is and what is the real values of inclusivity, democracy is. So I think I don't want to dump it down, but I think it's a very, very long journey for us. But to go through that, I think we will go through that by educating each other and with solidarity, and of course advocacy as well.
Thank you. Maybe Sawang could speak on this, because I was struck by the role of memory and history in all of your art. And as you were speaking, I think there's kind of a lot of evocative things from your past and your family history that come through in this work. And so maybe you could address this topic of history and memory and how to redress, all things past as we move forward.
Yeah, it's a extremely difficult question for me, especially as currently, even if we look at the Shan, RCSS and SSPP, which is an army that was created by my grandmother, are fighting, right? So the Shan are fighting each other, and so this has always been a kind of Burma is an extremely divided country, and this relationship between the Shah and that we're not able to even get along under this. So it's you know, I don't know. You know, I'm a pessimist in many ways. I really don't know how we're going to get out of this, and it seems like the history just repeats itself, and we as people have to kind of like there's a certain realization that we have to make, you know, a certain consciousness that we have to arrive as people in order to like move forward. Now we are extremely divided, and of course even within, for example, the new unity government itself, essentially, I feel that you know, NUG is still NLD in its core, and NLD's been doing a lot of things that had been marginalizing ethnic nationality for the last decade. So I don't know. I really hope. You know, and when it comes to even violence, I mean, I don't really, I see violence and armed uprising. I mean, from looking at my family history, it only presents itself only as a deadlock. And I think for the young people, it's probably important for them to kind of how to, I mean, learn how to articulate their demands, I suppose, you know, I mean, but I really don't have any answer.
Htike, would you like to touch on this?
Yes, I think like I will always, as someone who's studied about the politics, I will always come from the political point of view. I mean, if you ask me how to get out from the situations, I think that also what Winnie mentioned, like education, you know, like you know, like education, advocacy, and also those things can be only happen when we have a government accommodating all the things needed. So I will always say we need a strong government body who will be accommodating all the democratic norms, democratic functions, including like as someone has mentioned, that ethnic marginalization in the country and domination has to be really abolished from the system and from the political structure. So it's a vice versa. We need a kind of people who know that we how to really shape a government, and we also need a government who want to accommodate all their democratic norms, and not anyway like there's so much thing you can do within your own governmental structure. I mean, of course, we need international community support. However, the real change can happen only internally from in people from inside. That has to come from people inside, and a government body who would like to really accommodate and do something together with the people. Lead the people in a good way, in an appropriate way. So as I have mentioned in my talk in the previously, like all the things happened in the last 10 years, it was completely we have gone so much wrong. Now we have got a time really, another time in the history repeating again, as we heard from different speaker. And we are completely like in a situation without any sort of resilient resistance, because of everything has been crushed from the last 10 years. So this is the time now to rebuild again the resistance, and from within the community and within also our society and within the country with the political structure. So that's going to be the only thing I can foresee. I mean, this is a long term, actually. It's not going to happen in a couple of years. It's not going to happen. It has to be like a long term. We need to aim for like a long term vision as a long term vision. Thank you.
Can I just pop in here, because we have quite a few, about 12 or 15 questions now. But if I could just pop in here to just push Htike on one of the points that you just made. You made it earlier as well, which is, you know, what happened in the last 10 years, and that you said that, you know, there was a lot that was incorrect and wrong in what happened, but it was a viable experiment, which took a certain course and has led to a lot of disillusionment at several levels. And I'm curious about two things, and one of them actually appears in a question over here, and I will read out that question to you because I want to give credit to the person who asked the question as well, is that what lies at the heart, and I'd like all the panelists to think and dwell on this, is what lies at the heart of our discussion today is what is the future of democracy in Myanmar? And when one says what is the future, there are multiple pathways through which one could arrive at that. And then there are multiple stages at which one could arrive at different degrees of political maturity and evolution that would ultimately, one hopes, lead to a stronger democracy. And when I say a stronger democracy, what I essentially mean is the strengthening of institutions within the polity that uphold the principles of democracy. That it's the institutions that keep it going, because people will come and go. So this is really at the core of it. And as you said, it's the last 10 years, in retrospect, when democracy came to Myanmar, it's not just the people of Myanmar who were, very, very hopeful and looked at it with a lot of happiness. But as Wai Hnin said very, very eloquently, a lot of people on the outside also took to it in a way as though there was a finality in that moment of arrival, which we now know it really actually wasn't so. And part of the reason it wasn't so was the manner in which the NLD aligned itself in a certain sense with the military in Myanmar, and the absolutely, and one has to be absolutely clear in saying this. I have to be absolutely clear in saying it, that the Rohingya genocide is absolutely unforgivable. Nothing can explain it. And it is important, I think, to consider, Htike, since you were speaking about the Rohingya, so I am asking this of the Rohingya, but as Sawang said, there are so many ethnic groups. It is such a difficult and complicated constituency of ethnic groups, Myanmar. What does democracy looking ahead look like to, say, the Rohingyas? Now, this is also part of a question that someone asked, and if you give me a moment, okay, so here's the question, and it is, Htike, it's actually directed to you. I'll read out the question. NUG's and Burma's stance on Rohingya appear to be changing to more conciliatory lines. They're becoming more conciliatory, which was something someone else mentioned as well. What opportunities do you think the post-coup situation could create for Rohingya people? That's the question, okay? Do you want to answer briefly? And then we can take up more questions as well as open this up, because I do want to bring in something that David said and Wai Hnin said, which is the whole question of the role of the international community. Because when we do events over here at LSE, and I look at it in a very wide-angled way, the international is also not a homogeneous group. And what is the international, what can the international UK do versus the international Bangladesh, India, countries in the region, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, okay? And there is China. And China is a very, very important example, because it is important to bear in mind that China has its own dynamics in that region vis-a-vis the other countries. So there is that question of what can the international do, but we'll come to that later. Htike, please speak now.
I think first we also have to understand what's the components of the democracy mean, right? There is elections, there is which is going to be voted by probably the voting majority of people will always have a kind of right to really get win, you know, like if you have elections components. That is part of the democracy, which has been in Burma in the last 10 years. Like, so the reason where the majority of being voted to NLD is also because they get a vote, so they become a legitimate governments. If you look at from the Rohingya situation, so the politicians also was like a kind of, it's a popularity. They want a kind of popularity. What is the popular concept in the country? So then that is one of part of the escalating of the Rohingya crisis, because nobody want to really talk about it. You know, of course there is some international pressure. Again, the international support is very limited, as you probably discussed in after my comment. So looking at what kind of democracies, it will be pretty much probably the same, you know, as I said, unless we have a government body who like to accommodate all the norms of the democracy, I mean, like a minority right, inclusive, you know, inclusive, all the ethnic inclusive democracy, which also concern federal democracy. But again, for the Rohingya issue, when we say federal democracy, there is another kind of layer of problem with the Rakhine ethnic group. How we gonna really also overcome these things? So the dynamic of the problem is kind of pretty much a kind of layer by layer in the Rohingya situation, but the Rohingya is also like minority in the country and minority in the Rakhine State. So that is kind of a problem in the country. So unless we have a government body which is really fairly and then inclusive all the democracy, I think the situation will be pretty much the same for the Rohingya. And international community would always support the national government body. I mean, the reason why the international was also neglected or, you know, withdraw is also because we have a civilian government body who supported everything. They said, oh, you can withdraw all the sanction, you know, including Aung San Suu Kyi herself said, request the international community saying, now you can withdraw and you can really, all the sanction has been removed because of the elected government body has requested the international community. Of course, there are also like a China, you know, like as you say, it's not homogeneous, like very divided international community, even among the activist group, among the scholar, among the different actor, they have different way of supporting this crisis. You know, there is also divided. Some will group to NLD, some will say no, it's ethnic, right? So the way of we understanding what is democracy and what is the a kind of a crisis we can get up the crisis is so much divided in the idea. That's gonna be my comment. Thank you.
Okay, there's one brief question, another one for you, which if you can answer briefly, then we'll go to David and to Wai Hnin. And there's actually one that ties up also with what Sawang said. And the question to you, Htike, is, could you say a bit more about what you've seen about the displacement of non-militarized people along the Thailand border, and if relatively open places like Mesot or
yeah.
Sorry, I don't know the correct pronunciation. Yeah. Have blocked movement, have places like that blocked movement. You can keep your answer brief, please.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really have enough information, but I know that Thailand was at the beginning, they were pushing back the current refugee in the border, where they're heavily fighting between KNU and then also military. And I know that now there has a kind of informal refugee kind of internally displaced place they has been hosting. But then I haven't really see, I'm sorry, I am not really up to date on this thing, but I probably, someone from the panel can answer. But what I have seen is Thailand is pretty much very careful to have a refugee in this site again, like they don't really want them. So they are pushing back, and then the displacement has been very informally happening along the border, and also a kind of humanitarian aid too.
Okay, does anyone very briefly have any comments to make about Thailand and how it is responding to the issue of refugees coming in? Because there are a couple of other comments and part of it has already been answered by Htike, but anyone? Dominic, were you going to say something?
I was going to say that as non-signatories, Thailand is not, doesn't formally take refugees. So all the refugees who are here are not recognized under international law. All the refugee camps that are north of Mae Sot, which have housed hundreds of thousands of people in the past, around 100,000 people, different refugee camps north of and south of Mae Sot, and also along the Shan border, have been unrecognized. They're not recognized as refugees, I should say. So the groups of Karen people who are currently along the Thai border are moving back and forth between areas governed by the KNU and areas which are in Thailand but are technically quite remote. So they're basically staying along the riverbank of the Salween, which forms the border between the two countries. And the Thais have some arrangements informally to let them stay, but these arrangements are very much subject to change, and something the Thais definitely want to keep quiet.
Okay. Did anyone else want to say anything on this? Wai Hnin, did you want to?
I think the situation with the refugee and also internally displaced people is getting worse and worse. And also there is a monsoon in Burma now. So a lot of them they're not only the ethnic civilians, but also a lot of people from city areas fled the city area to join the ethnic armed organizations and fight with them. And they don't have shelter or food or medicine that, any other essentials that they need. And it's very devastating that Thailand is pushing back because, they never wanted refugees. They still have those refugees from the past, civil wars as well. And we saw that several journalists were arrested in Thailand. I can't remember the town now, but there were serious talk about deportation and stuff. So it is very worrying situation. Just to summarize it, yeah.
Okay, great. Can we move to the question of what the international community can do? And shall we start with the international community that is more at a distance? Because one of the questions, and it was a point that David made as well when he was talking about EAOs. By the way, David, there are a couple of questions for you that are more directly about EAOs, and I'll ask them separately to you. But David made this point about EAOs that they don't want to be seen merely as pawns of foreign powers, and that the effectiveness and the impact of therefore the international community can only be that far and not farther. And Wai Hnin also spoke quite a bit about what she thinks the international community can do. It is still not unfair to pose the question that one is entitled to wonder, while looking at it from a wide angle, that if an American journalist has been arrested on his way out just 2 days ago, and not been allowed to leave the country, can international community pressure really be effective at this moment? Is there anything that the international community that is not in the immediate region, can it be effective? And this is a question that is that runs alongside what Wai Hnin said about arms embargo and things of that sort. But David, do you want to start, and then the others could come?
Thanks very much. I'm not sure what other questions there are about EAOs, so I might, already touch on some of those points now, and forgive me for that. But obviously, on the question of effectiveness of the international community, I think there's two ways of seeing it. On the one hand, what can the international community do now in the very constraints of United Nations Security Council being divided, China is not going to agree to any meaningful sanctions, etc. There are still, I think, some important ways of effectuating important targeted sanctions against the military. We've seen just now that Total, one of the big gas companies, that's been running pipeline from the Andaman coast to Thailand, basically, has responded to some kind of, mostly like grassroots pressures, including, of course, Burma Campaign UK, etc., Human Rights Watch, and so on, to basically stop paying fees from the pipeline operation to a state-owned enterprise that's basically, the military's coffers. And of course, as Earth Rights International and others have pointed out, this is like about 10 or 15% of the overall gas revenues that are flowing into the military's coffers, right? So we can't forget that company like Total, French oil and gas company, went in to build the Yadana pipeline in the first place with the help of military clearing operations at the hand of like crazy atrocities, basically, against the Karen people, all of the kind of forced displacement and so on. I mean, so companies like Total will absolutely not just do something voluntarily, and they will only do as much as kind of shapes the public image, responding to grassroots pressures. And what I'm saying here is that, for instance, targeted sanctions against these direct revenues, very different to blanket sanctions on the country that would hurt like workers and so on in garment factories, right? But targeted sanctions on these direct revenues against of the military are still possible in terms of when you look, for instance, at targeted sanctions that have been elsewhere in the world. And I'm thinking here, for instance, about the Dodd-Frank Act 1502 that was imposed on the Eastern DRC in sub-Saharan Africa on so-called conflict minerals. But these are sanctions that don't have to go through the United Nations Security Council, actually, because this was a sanction through US law, sanctioning US companies to say, well, if you are getting out conflict minerals from that area, for instance, or from that area, you have to certify that they are not contributing to the coffers of different armed factions. There's been a lot of downsides to that. What I'm saying is, nevertheless, that there are still tools for Western policymakers to circumvent the United Nations Security Council to actually tighten those screws, because the Totals of the world and Chevrons of the world won't do it themselves. And despite what we've heard, of like, cutting parts of that budget. So maybe that's it from me, just in terms of concretely for thinking about the situation in the context that, of course, my Security Council will remain blocked, etc. Right? But there's still things that can be done.
And what you are saying is that, given the situation that we are in terms of the power dynamics in the UN Security Council, what you are saying is that at the individual level, effectively, what will be effective is something that impacts financially.
I mean, these are, of course, it's a measure of things. Sorry, maybe I should have, and that's what I meant. I don't know what other questions were there, but there's different things. Obviously, there's on the one hand these immediate things that can still be done in terms of tightening the screws on the military's coffers. On top of that, I think the most important thing, and that is not something that will have the most immediate effect, is to foster the unity of those diverse opposition movements that we've heard. And I mean, all my co-panelists have, very eloquently talked about different points, of why different parts, and especially also ethnic nationality movements, need to somewhat be taken much more seriously, because otherwise, with what we are seeing at the moment, there's too much fragmentation in the opposition movement. So the NUG cannot just be an NLD plus, but there needs to be, I think, from the international community, actually, some rethinking also of what the last 10 years were. And again, my co-panelists have talked about some of those things already, in terms of how one can actually take those different parts of these movements together, because in the end, the Tatmadaw has been striving for, its whole existence, including the calculus at the moment, on its very divide and rule. So if that doesn't work anymore, and I think this is something that the international community can contribute to undercut that divide and rule approach of the Tatmadaw, then I think there's much more long-term to be won there.
Okay, great. Your other questions are not in this category, but before we go back to that, Wai Hnin, what can the international community do effectively? You did mention things that you thought that UK could do.
Well, one thing they can do is not to cut international aid on Burma, because UK is considering, I mean, they already cut aid on Rohingya refugees, and they are talking about cutting more international aid to Burma. I think it would be very devastating for people, because like I mentioned before, the number of IDPs is growing inside the country, and they have nothing. And, you know, they need all the assistance that they can get. So humanitarian aid is very important. And talking about humanitarian aid, I think the government agencies need to be more flexible while funding that, because, you know, you can't give this money to the military, because what's the point of, you know, giving money to the military? It's not a no-brainer. But they can, you know, they can fund the civil society organizations across, you know, ethnic areas, and they can work with these civil society organizations because they know deep down about the situation, and they know about the area very well. So I think it is very important that humanitarian aid continue to go through the CSOs, and also to fund these human rights organizations inside the country, because we need them to document the human rights violations going on. So that's one side. And also with the, you know, we come back to the root causes of the problem is the military. The military is committing all these, you know, atrocities. That's why we are having a humanitarian crisis in the country. And now we are on the, I mean, we are already in poverty, and many people, you know, don't have jobs because of COVID or CDM, or many, you know, reasons because of the coup. So UN Security Council is failing to do their job. You know, they have tabled so many resolutions, but they came out with weak resolution that does nothing for Burma. And we see statements after statements. I mean, in the beginning, it was an encouragement for us, but it's not anymore. And UN Secretary General could use the diplomatic technique and actually get on a plane, go to Burma, meet the generals, talk about, you know, demand the release of all political detainees, and talk about the humanitarian aid, and talk about the issues. So that's one, you know, diplomatic tool that he can be using, and he's not. And we usually come back to China and Russia blocking the, you know, using the veto power. I mean, China's interest is, of course, the natural resources in our country. They are, you know, selling their veto power to get cheap access to you know, natural resources. And Russia is, you know, because they want the dictatorship body, so they're funding the military, you know, selling weapons and etc. But when it comes to arms embargo, the countries can actually go around that. They can unilaterally impose arms embargo. So if country like UK or the US, and if they work together, and what we've been calling, one of the things that we've been calling for is the global coalitions of countries imposing arms embargo, but it needs someone to lead it. So, you know, we need countries like the UK, work with the US, like-minded states, and actually make it happen. And the real, you know, achievement, or if we call it achievement, is the Japan, countries like Japan and South Korea joining it, imposing arms embargo unilaterally means that other countries can follow. So, you know, we keep pushing for that. And of course, everything's been very slow. And David already mentioned about the, you know, gas and oil revenues. Usually what we get from companies like Total and Chevron is, oh, if we don't do this job, if we pull out, then other companies from China and Russia and other companies will come in and do the same business, and the military will continue to get the revenue. So what we've been pushing the US to do is to impose sanctions on what is the enterprise, the military oil and gas enterprise. So to put you know, sanctions on that bank account, because that bank account is in dollars. So the US can actually put sanctions on it. So that's one effective thing that the US can do. So there are so many things that we've been calling for, but of course, we are very mindful that some may be slow and some may take years to come to see the result of it. But it's important to do that. And There is no, single magic wand to solve the situation in the country, but the international community have failed to take action for many, many years now. And I think it's time for them to get on with it and actually do their job.
Okay, thank you. Dominic, did you want to come in and say something?
Yeah, I was going to ask Sawang, the points that people have been raising about the international community in some way relate to potentially one of my favorite pieces of art based on politics in Myanmar, which Sawang has done, the Peace Industrial Complex. And I kind of wondered if you could speak to that to some extent in relation to what can be done, because he details, this painting details complex connections between military companies and various different crony actors within the country. I think would be something interesting to go into.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
So, sorry, can I just add a couple of things, because there's some things that have come in from the audience for you.
Okay.
But please do respond to what Dominic said. And in fact, what I was going to say was very, very close to Dominic's, except that it wasn't related to a piece of art of yours, which was that taking on board the fact that you did mention when you were speaking that you're pessimistic, having spent so much of time outside and found yourself in a situation where you have to spend so much of time in your life outside of the country. But in the context of what David and Wai Hnin were just saying, if you were to take a step away from all this, what do you see are things over a long-term view backwards that you think that the international community could do, not going into details, but could do that would be effective towards the institution or the restoration of democracy, however you would like to put it? Because obviously a lot of people are also clear that they don't want a reinstitution of the same democratic sort of dynamics again that has happened in the last 10 years. But any form of democracy would also be better, I say in the same breath. The question for you is, do you see any changes in the Tatmadaw now in comparison to the Tatmadaw in the 1960s?
Okay.
That's a question from the audience. I asked you one, Dominic asked you one.
Yeah. So any changes? Well, I think the Tatmadaw in the 60s are still much weaker than the Tatmadaw now, right? The Tatmadaw has been shoring up armed and soldiers in the last, I mean, especially 10 years. That I mean, the only thing Tatmadaw doesn't have is its credibility from the people. I mean, they have lost all respect. But I really don't know. The question is, we really have to talk about, like, we really need to get rid of the military in Burma. There is no other way around it. This is sort of like, but they are almost impossible to get rid of. So what is the solution, right? So this is something that I think about, but I don't really have an answer for. In regarding to the peace map, in my practice, I investigate this issue because I'm sort of disgusted by what was happening in Burma. Like, on one level, it's very complicated with all of these network and stuff going on. But then on another level, it's very simple, like simple, that is the military is killing its people, and this is the bottom line of it, and this is they are the enemy of the people, and they're the one that we have to think about getting rid of them, not giving them any concession anymore. And then regarding the international community, I just have to bring up the EU is still renting Nay Win residents, right? And they are paying like 80,000 euro a month. It's like for us, it's like €1 million a year for 7-year contract. And meanwhile, you have a Nay Win showing up on social media, faking 3-finger salute. I mean, it's a kind of it's part of a pattern that it's in a way. The EU is saying to the people of Burma that they don't care. They don't. I mean, this is really so apparent, so clear to me that the international community don't care or don't care that they don't know or this is the message that they're giving. At least me. This is what how I see it. And yeah,
that's very powerful, given that you live in the EU.
That's right. Yeah, they're gonna come after me.
No, they're not going to come after you, but it is an important thing to say, because I wonder if, I mean, I'm mapping all this in my mind, and it's interesting how we're moving in the discussion from effectiveness and impact and potential and possibility to being voluntarily ineffective under the garb of ignorance and lack of familiarity, and being able to allocate responsibility to the lack of institutions or to the weakness of it or to the nature of things, etc. It's interesting. Sorry, were you going to say anything more, Sawang?
No, that's it. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Could I, Dominic, did you want to say anything quickly? But because we have quite a few other questions.
Sure, I was just going to jump on this point that Sawang said at the end, which ties to your point on institutions, which is what Sawang said about the international community not caring about not knowing. And I think that's something very interesting that the international community needs to look at themselves very deeply at how they've dealt with Myanmar, how they continue to deal with Myanmar in terms of a lack of knowledge, and then that, whether willfully or not, leading to significant policy missteps and in fact disasters. So that's something that I think is interesting for maybe to pick up on later.
Yeah, I just one more thing, right? Like, I think this is not even an appeal to the European institution, but the masses, the people, I want to quote Fanon in this sense that, he mentioned like the European mass must put on their thinking cap and stop playing the game of Sleeping Beauty, right? So this is how I see Burma is being treated. I mean, it's really, I couldn't say more. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure it was difficult even to say that. This is not the place, but I wouldn't on any other occasion be very interested to share with all of you the kind of responses that, say, a South Asia center gets when it decides to do an event on Myanmar, which in itself is very revealing of the way in which the gaze, as I call it, of the world towards a particular thing. And that's why in my initial remarks, I made it a point to say that Myanmar is very important for South Asia as well as for Southeast Asia. And that was one of the reasons why both the LSE Southeast Asia Center and the South Asia Center came together to do this event, as we did another event in the last term on Myanmar as well, because it is something that I think both these regions need to engage with for very important historical, if not cultural and strategic reasons. Right, now I am going to, Htike, I'm going to come to you with something, but if you just hang in there for a moment. David, the two questions to you, if you could keep your answers brief, please. One is, could you please share your view on the role of militias and border guard forces and illicit economy in the Tatmadaw state consolidation in the coming months or years? That's one question. The other one is, could you please share your view about divergences toward, sorry, there's something wrong over here in the sentence, divergences towards the coup from different EAOs. Okay, so divergences of the difference of view. I mean, it seems like different EAOs have different attitudes to the coup, such as the Wai.
Okay, thanks. Two big questions, but I'll try to be brief. So militias first. Very interesting when we look at, for instance, Rakhine State at the moment, where the Tatmadaw has mobilized the so-called border guard forces, which are Karen units that have split in the mid-1990s from the Karen National Union under back then basically the DKBA, and at the time were really quite important, significant in overrunning the headquarters of the KNU. There's an interesting and I think important difference to the way that the BGF, as the border guard forces that are being mobilized now again, as well dangerous as they are, of course, to EAO forces, but there's maybe an important difference to the mid-1990s. In the mid-1990s, it was quite clear that the units that split off from, here in that case, the KNU, had genuine grievances of their own and that were directed through kind of Tatmadaw propaganda also against the KNU. So in that time, they had a more intrinsic motivation, so to speak, of fighting against their ethnic brethren there. I don't think they have the same intrinsic motivation now. There's been some reporting of like how, for instance, some of the, and that comes to your other part of the question, illicit economies here play a role. Some of the leadership level quite obviously have, a lot of economic business interests together with frontline commands and other Tatmadaw commanders, etc. But I don't think that the rank and file necessarily, who often don't benefit from that anyway, right, are intrinsically motivated by that. And in fact, I think they're actually very much disincentivized at the moment by fighting against whom they also in many ways might see as fighting for the right side of history, as in, for instance, here the KNU then, and of course in the context of the Spring Revolution more generally, right? So I would say that surely the Tatmadaw will attempt to rely further on militias and BGF forces, etc., and will be able to do so. But in some ways, that might actually be more difficult than used to be in the past for some of the reasons that I was just giving. The other question about divergences towards the coup from different EAOs, well, I was giving a few factors, I think, to think about. Maybe just to raise the two ones that I think are quite important. Think about the kind of non-homogeneous decision-making in these EAOs and the ways that their grassroots are quite important. So we know, of course, that different EAOs are different. I mean, they're all very much embedded in local communities, but the ones I would know best is the KIO and the KNU, and they do have in many ways quite some, well, if not democratic institutions within them, maybe that kind of look like liberal democracies. There is a responsive mechanism between leadership and the rank and file and the grassroots. That is not, the same, maybe that kind of public sphere that exists within all the EAOs. So you're mentioning the Wai State Army. That of course has less of a public sphere. So the kind of dealings with the Tatmadaw can be less scrutinized also by grassroots activists in those movements. And the other thing that is to come back also what Wai Hnin was saying, well, the way, and in particular what Sawang was saying, the way that these groups have been tried to splinter and to be fragmented, or that they were tried to kind of divided and fragmented, that was aided in some ways actually by that kind of peace industrial complex that came up, that was in itself fueled by European involvement in the peace process, for instance, where, say, for instance, the World Bank was giving money that was going directly into military budgets, that was very much then supporting a military outlook on the ceasefire process, on the peace process, and so on. And that has actually like opened up even more cracks within some of those movements. And so I think these two factors are quite important to look at, the way that they're embedded in local communities and the way that also the kind of internal differences play out. Okay,
thank you. Wai Hnin, there's an interesting question for you. I'm going to request you to keep your answer short, because you know why when I ask you the question. But then we will come to Htike, because one of the discussions we do want to have is what is the role that other countries in the region can play, given that they have played certain kinds of roles, for Bangladesh most prominently in the whole Rohingya issue. The question is this, that let me find it. It was actually rather amusing, but it's a very important question. But the question in essence was that, yes, while we all understand that China and Russia, involvement of China and Russia would be essential for arms and embargo to make a substantial impact. What incentives do you think we can provide to them so that they might change their minds?
I think I will have to go back to my previous point. We've been using this China and Russia argument for, over and over again to do anything. I mean, of course, there is a big problem with the UNSC because of China and Russia, but depending on which country you're in, you can identify whether your country has an arms embargo on Burma or not. Because as far as I'm aware, I think around 140 countries in the world don't have arms embargo on Burma. So if you can identify and push your government to impose that unilaterally, we can move forward with the, like I said before, global coalitions of countries imposing arms embargo. I think we need to start thinking how we can go around China and Russia rather than thinking them as a blockage every time we talk about the effective action. If the UNSC is not an effective action, this is the other way to go around it. So I think the global coalition is the solution that we came to. And depending the person who asked the question, you can identify whether your country has an armed embargo on Burma or not.
Great. Dominic, were you going to say something and I interrupted? All right. I should mention for the benefit of the audience that there are also a lot of comments here that I'm not reading out for the sake of time. But the next thing for us to discuss is what is the role that regional powers can play simply because of their proximity to the country, the physical proximity to the country, and therefore impact. And there are quite a few important and powerful regional countries in the region. Does anyone want to start with India?
Can I just jump on top of that in terms of regional partners? I think something on top of the India and Bangladesh and the Chinas of the world, something that people in the region have spoken a lot about is how ASEAN will handle this crisis and how they have handled it so far. So I think people could definitely add to on that. That would be something that'd be interesting.
Htike, do you want to speak first?
Sorry. Now I think it's a good opportunity to engage with the national unity government and to push them and pressure them to where, I mean, for instance, for the Rohingya crisis, the root cause was more citizenship issue, then probably this is the best time to engage national unity government and then make pressure and then from international community and then solve this problem. It's a good time to really write on a proper law on that. What does the citizenship mean for the whole inclusive citizenship for everyone in Burma, instead of keep holding this 3 different class of citizenship in 1982 citizenship law. Those in outside the country.
Sorry, can you just explain that the 3-tier system in one sentence for those who might not know in the audience?
Yeah, it's a class. They have it is with their 3 different class in where you have one ethnic group has a kind of Tainza, which is a native of the country. It's a classified group of by the Newin regimes, and they are automatically become citizens. They don't need to provide if they belong to one of these ethnic group, and they are the citizen of the country. But there are other 2 groups where they say you have to prove that you are here in the country back in just even before the British time. So this group considers very difficult to prove that your ancestors are here, because you're not belonging to the the 135 ethnic group designed by the Ne Win regime. So then if you are out of this list, and you have to make extra effort to prove that you're with all the document, and which is actually failing, but it is falling for the Rohingya people. And there is other group, you are foreigner, you can apply and then become a citizen, which is naturalized citizenship. So then as Rohingya are not recognized as one of the ethnic group in the country, then they become automatically in second class, where you have to provide document and then become a route to their citizenship, to their route to the citizenship, which has been happening since 40 years over. And yeah, so okay, and then if you look at the other causes in, like, for example, in Bangladesh, right, they are hosting a million refugee, and they could still coordinate with their other international community, you know, because they are refugee and they have a right to really have a refugee right. But I know that there's so much difficulty there. Bangladesh is also considering them as a displaced people, you know, like not a refugee. And as also when David also mentioned in what happened in Thailand, you know, they don't want to consider people coming as a refugee because they don't want to recognize the refugee conventions. But however, if you are in a country, then you have to get a refugee right, and you have to get a right to resettle, you know, as it is. If we think this is one of the mechanisms in the international community and the world has recognized refugee has a right to resettle, and this Rohingya refugee has a right to resettle too. But I know that this is a big difficulty, but that's why I said the first stage is to really engage national unity governments now, and then including like pressure them, and make this root cause start to solve together. Although there is a limitation of having a military junta, you know, have difficulty, but writing the law and then recognizing in the law is a good step for now to do.
Okay. Wai Hnin, did you want to come in and say anything about what regional countries could do, and also ASEAN?
We have seen that, I mean, usually, you know, ASEAN has the policy of non-interference. They don't get involved, and because Burma, you know, what's happening in Burma is an internal issue and stuff. But if we use this internal issue argument, let's say for countries like China and, you know, neighboring country, it doesn't work because of the situation happening inside the country. We have an influx of refugees, you know, in border regions. So what's happening inside the country has a huge impact on neighboring countries. And also, you know, let's just say on a very purely superficial level, China interest is the economic interest in the country. And if the country has no stability, then it will have impact on their business as well. So, you know, if they want to act purely because of their economic interest, they have to do so. And we've seen again that the ASEAN is actually not very useful. You know, they invited Mya Aye, and they gave Mya Aye a podium to talk about his propaganda while he was talking about, and, you know, engaging with the neighboring country. And ASEAN, his army was killing people inside the country, and they came up with 5 points, you know, from the ASEAN summit, but none of them have been honored by the military. And it's you know, evidence after evidence. This is the latest evidence that military is not something you can do engagement with. You know, the international community thinks that, oh, everything that happened in 2010 and 2008 happened because of the, you know, we need to engage with the military and change the tactics and stuff. The military started changing and introducing the civilian type parliamentary system because they got this 2008 constitution in place. They made sure that they had power in place before, you know, they introduced any type of reforms in the country. It was not a compromise. It was not the engagement that's been, you know, successful. So this ASEAN summit meeting was the latest example. I hope that the neighboring country can use to, you know, realize that military is not something you can engage with. And I agree with Htike that they should be engaging with the NUG and improving their policy on Rohingya, and also, you know, working with them to ensure that anything that can come out of because NUG has a unique opportunity to think outside of the box. And, you know, ASEAN countries and neighboring countries can actually strengthen this creativity or the, you know, outside of the box idea. So they need to be working together with the NUG rather than the military.
Great, thank you. David, what can neighbors do? What can ASEAN do? Should they do anything? Should they not do anything?
Well, they should surely, yeah. First of all, I very much agree with both Htike as well as Wai Hnin about the importance, yeah, of recognizing the NUG, of engaging with the NUG critically so, right? So I don't want to repeat that, but I just very much agree. The other thing I think that we have to look at, and of course ASEAN has its so-called non-interference policy and so on, is that ASEAN, where there's different forces within ASEAN at the moment, right? ASEAN is going to be really important. I mean, it hasn't done much maybe to that effect yet, but it would be very important, because if you have a regional power or a regional organization like ASEAN, that might actually be swaying, say, for instance, China and Russia for their decision making. We've seen these things with, for instance, the Arab League and the African Union in the case of Libya. Of course, it's a bit different in China's own so-called backyard, but nevertheless, I think a strong regional lead is very important. And what I'm saying here is, like, of course, like, ASEAN hasn't been very constructive, and we heard all of that just now. And at the same time, there are, for instance, Indonesia and Singapore actually pushing the envelope, pushing the boundary of this non-interference policy. There's also countries that hold back, and that significantly is Thailand, actually, right? That also comes back to, you know, Thailand pushing back refugees and so on, right? And this is, you know, something that has developed over the kind of honeymoon period of Thailand with Myanmar over the last years only. That wasn't always like that, right? And so in a way, it's like to identify, of course, different countries here within ASEAN and engaging with them to change, you know, that approach of ASEAN. It's not going to be, you know, quite surely in this world of international diplomacy, it's not going to be something that emerges overnight, but I think this is the way. The other thing, just briefly, is China quite obviously has its economic interests. China will quite obviously continue to support whoever is in power in Myanmar. And at the same time, I don't think that China has the most organic interest of the military being in power in Myanmar. We've heard just now, of course, that, you know, the military has, like, signed off on the most Belt and Road Initiative projects and so on. Yeah, but first of all, well, China would, I think, not just appreciate stability in the country for those projects, if we just assume they only have an economic rationale, and that's a big part of it, but also they would like to sell those projects to the Burmese public, basically, right? So the Burmese public doesn't, or if the regime doesn't have any legitimacy in the Burmese public, I mean, those projects obviously also have no legitimacy within the Burmese public. And that is also why China actually had such a good relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi and signed off a lot of Belt and Road initiatives with her before, right? And so this is just one of the weak spots, I'm saying, for the kind of Chinese foreign policy at the moment that I think need to be engaged with and targeted at, actually, right? And maybe just very last point, I think Japan is really important there, obviously, as well. And they've been inviting to see NUG members, etc. It's just not a power to be forgotten in that.
Okay, great. Dominic is going to come in now. I just want to say we have 12 minutes. I have one more question from the audience, which is important, and then I will invite all of you to make some closing remarks. But Dominic, go first.
Just by having a quick look at some of the comments, I was reminded of kind of throughout our discussions, people were talking about unity, and we just talked about the international response, but internal unity, you know, by the name, simply the name National Unity Government. Obviously, they've made some attempt to try and attempt to do this, and we've said there's some disaccord on that front. And then people in the comments are talking about fighting in Demoso and Karenni. Actually, I know Htike mentioned Karenni and other areas. For example, in Chin State, we have all these defense forces, local defense forces, some of which it's unclear whether they are what the NUG calls PDFs or whether they're local defense forces. So I think maybe to talk more about this question of internal national unity would be something that would be interesting to kind of briefly touch on. Maybe Sawang could touch on that in some sense. What do you think?
Sawang, can I say that there's a last minute question for you, which is actually related to what Dominic just said, which is that, do you think there are ways in which artists could use their work to raise awareness about specific issues of the, like unity and et cetera, et cetera? Do you think there are things that artists could do specifically, both within the country and outside? But go for it, please speak.
Yeah, I think regarding artists and artwork, artwork has been quite instrumental in this coup, because when the coup happened, and there's even a website, I think Facebook page with the art that basically these are the art that are made by I think even young people and all sorts of people that are, so it's in this sense I see that it's quite hopeful, and art is, I suppose, it's a way to find a solace, I suppose, and hope, and specifically I suppose in my work I could go around words and just show a picture that says much more than words could say. And yeah, and what was the other question from Dominic?
It's something that I guess perhaps could go into towards the closing remarks if you want to, but this question of internal unity coming back from the international response, I guess, was as we see violence erupting in different ways.
Yeah. Regarding the EAOs and ethnic minorities, ethnic nationalities in Burma, we all have different desire and different priorities, right? So it's extremely, I think, difficult to find something that could. I mean, we already see it in the last 10 years in the peace process how this unfolds, and we I mean, even amongst the for example, the Shan that I've already mentioned, we have been fractured for so long, and even this idea of ethnic nationalism, it had been a response to the military chauvinism, right? And I think the bottom, at the end, the problem is the fact that military is doing the divide and conquer, and we are just falling for it years after years. It repeats itself constantly, and I see it in my the generation of my father, and then you see it even to this day, and I don't know what even the members of new government within this, they also have to have a kind of self-examination of what their real ideologies are, and my sense of the what new unity governments are doing, or the CRPH are doing, is they're like catching up, always doing this catching up game, and I wish that they would just take the lead on this and not. I mean, it's this when the SAC decided say, oh, AA is not a terrorist anymore, and then CRPH then constantly trying to catch up with this game, and from a that's all I could say. I suppose I couldn't. For me, it's not. It's always been a puzzle of, and this is this is an experience for me that it remains, like I said before, it remained with us, this trauma, this kind of a blind spot that I have when it comes to these things. So it's something that we need to work out, and it would only take time,
Sure. Thank you, Sawang. We have 5 minutes remaining, so I'm going to ask each of you to make your closing remarks. But what I will do is that I will ask you the question that has been posed, and perhaps you could use that answer as your closing remarks and speak for only a minute or a little more than that. And the question is this: do you think that in the post-coup scenario, that Tatmadaw has actually lost its legitimacy based on Burma chauvinism? And if so, what does it mean for the Tatmadaw's changing source of legitimacy as an institution in Myanmar? That's the question from a member of the audience, okay? David, do you want to go first and keep yourself as brief as you can?
Great question. I won't be able to answer this in a minute. I think what I'm trying to maybe just sort of reinstate is that will depend a lot on what other people have been saying in terms of how the NUG can foster a different narrative to that, right? How they can foster an inclusive narrative that is actually appealing to all of the different movements and peoples of Burma, to undercut that, basic, very raison d'etre of the military in the first place, right? And that is something I think the NUG kind of needs to do itself, but also can be engaged with from the outside. And that will then is a brilliant question, but I think that will very much be my very brief answer to what will shape most of that outcome, because it could go either way. You're absolutely right.
Htike?
Yeah, I think as David has mentioned, I think it's exactly how the people and then NUG and how people engage in NUG now, and also how NUG has shaped the Myanmar politics. But I will always say it's so important that people engage NUG the way they have to shape it, because it's a government body, so it has to be really like by people voices. It's very important. Activist voice, and then all the scholar voice, and also like people voice are so important. Then they have to take it accordingly. And also as a country with a very diverse, I think we really need a proper national reconciliation somehow in the country. Without it, it will be again and again in the same thing. So we haven't seen a proper national reconciliation yet. We know that the Tatmadaw has no place for anyone in Burma, because it's a common enemy, as we heard from different panelists. That is quite clear. But to get rid of this is, as we have to build an ideology, what is a Burma, Myanmar has to be. We have got so much civil war, and then a crisis, and humanitarian and genocides, war crimes. That has also been not only because of the military problem, also because we didn't have a proper participation or properly understood what is democracy we are aiming for, and what is the unity in this kind of a country where very diverse ethnic group, and which has also a remain of colonial legacy of in every part of the political structure, including like a law, including all the constitution. So those things has to be rid of our from our new Burma Myanmar. So this is probably the beginning, but what kind of result we are having is exactly how we address the problem. We have it. If it is only like a temporary, picking up one problem and solving, as one of you have already mentioned, just to combat the military, because there is so much thing has been rooted already along the military institution and military administrations. So it's not only that easy that we are aiming for to defeat military in very short time, because the rooted has been so much. So we have to get work on everything. Thank you.
Wai Hnin?
I agree with both David and Mya Aye. I think unity has to come from the national reconciliation, and unity doesn't mean that it's being led by a majority of group asking minorities or ethnic nationalities to come together. I think it has to come, from all points. And if we have to take any lessons from the past, is that in the past 10 years, even under the civilian government, activists themselves and civilian governments, they were they didn't like criticism by the people. I mean, we need to understand what the core values of democracy and what core values of federal democracy is. And government needs to understand that, and people need to understand that. And we also see that people themselves are, defending the government if someone say something negative about the government. So I think it needs to start by educating people that democracy means the government needs to be able to hold accountable. We need to be able to criticize the government freely without being in prison. And so I think it's a very, very long journey for us. But I think with this coup, we are having the opportunity again to reshape the country's politics and to make the country into an inclusive federal democracy. So I hope for that.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but we have covered a lot of very difficult issues, and to hear about one's own country through such difficult registers is not easy for those who don't belong to the country to hear about it and see various kinds of tragedies unfold. But what I think, despite the various different types, kinds, genres of difficulties that several of you have referred to, and which are all lived realities, it is fair to say that not only is there good reason for hope, and that everyone, whether inside the country or outside the country, the international community, should do what they can to restore democracy and to institutionalize and institute democracy and democratic processes in Myanmar. I think the most important thing that needs to be said is that anyone who is following the situation closely on the ground will know that the spirit of democracy and the spirit of freedom is not lost in the people of that country. And those of you who are in this country, in Britain, will know that Channel 4 last week showed a half-an-hour program in its dispatches section called "Dying for Democracy" on Myanmar. It's an extremely difficult thing to watch, but it shows the spirit and the strength that, despite knowing there's a very long journey ahead, no one at any point considers giving up on it. And as Wai Hnin just said, and I think put it very, very interestingly, is that one should not necessarily look at the current situation in Myanmar as something that is a step backwards, but an opportunity to renegotiate, much as Htike also said, what it is to be democratic, and what is the kind of democracy and what is the kind of country that those who are living in that country and belong to that country want for it. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this discussion. I'm extremely grateful on behalf of the LSE South Asia Center, as well as the Sosui Hok Southeast Asia Center, who are our collaborators in this. Thank you, David Brenner. Thank you, Htike Htike. Thank you, Wai Hnin Pwint Thon. Thank you, Sawang Wongse Yongwei. And thank you, Dominic Dillabao Lefebvre, our student who has collaborated. We hope to do another event in the next term. The South Asia Center also hosts the Charles Wallace Burma Trust Visiting Fellowship, information for which is available on our website. But we do hope, I personally hope, in my capacity as Deputy Director of the South Asia Center, that Myanmar and its interests do not fall between the cracks of South Asia and Southeast Asia, and that we continue to engage with it. Good evening.